Buenos días a todos.
Hello, everyone. I want to start thanking Milken Institute and all involved in the organization of this event, and personally to Michael Milken for making this possible meeting. It is a pleasure for me to be here, surrounded by people with affinity of thought that makes me really feel at home. I want to start reflecting on this week's parasha, whose topic is very interesting. The Torah tells us that, before being slaves of the Egyptians, the Hebrews were free men used to perform jobs. Then, they were subjects to which they were made paying taxes, and only later they were finally forced to do forced labor, without any freedom or personal gain. What began as a free and voluntary relationship ended as a 400-year regime of the most abject slavery, which would only come to its end with the rebellion initiated by Moses. The point of this story is that it reminds us of how seductive it can be for the state to advance on individual freedom, and that oppression can begin in a subtle way and conclude in slavery before we do not realize. Therefore, it is essential to have a high guard, identify and abort the extralimitations of the state before they develop at an irreversible point. A little less than a year ago, in May, I exposed in Los Angeles, in another headquarters of this house, which I called My Ode to Capitalism. Surely some of you were present and remember. There I expressed my concern about how the West was abandoning his adventurous in business spirit to be seduced by the bureaucracy siren songs, regulation and unbridled public spending, which do nothing more than tithe inventiveness, overwhelm the freedom and property of men. I saw, and every time I see more crisp, expressions of these extralimitations, subtle and not so much, of which the Torah warns. I knew all this from its own experience, since in Argentina that destructive path had begun 100 years ago, and we knew its results firsthand. Therefore, I said before you that the Argentines were a kind of prophets of an apocalyptic future, and that both Argentina and the rest of the nations that were twisting their course towards the precipice had to rectify their path in a drastic way to meet again with the ideas of freedom, which are nothing more than the civilizing soul that brings prosperity and progress. Today we live undeniable times of change. Literally, we are gathered here in Washington to testify the inauguration of President Trump, in what represents a milestone in our global crusade for freedom and the clearest evidence that a new era begins. We want to be protagonists of this time change. Therefore, I want to humble our experience humbly when it comes to capturing these ideas in our first year of government. The last time we talked, back in May, our economic program was going through its most difficult moment. The brief but hard drop in the activity to which the Argentine population was exposed, product of the sincereness of the economy, was at its lowest point. Both citizens and our government went through a fire test. As much as we had won the 2023 elections promising an economic adjustment and clarifying that there would be a recession in the process, listen and live it are diametrically different situations. The population went through this situation with courage and determination, giving a back of confidence to our management. In short, tell the truth pays. But, as the saying goes, always the darkest moment of the night precedes at dawn. And, as we anticipate since May, the economy rebounded in the form of the testing that our thesis and our prognosis were successful. Today, 8 months later, the sun shines strong in Argentina. 50 million Argentines carry out their lives with the confidence that the future will be better than the past. To quantify it in specific numbers, last May the activity had fallen about 4.5 points of the GDP with respect to when we assumed. Now, it is already in its initial value and growing. All this was given that, during the last year, we take endless measures to improve the economy and purchasing power of our citizens. At the beginning of our management, we had 15 consolidated fiscal deficit points, of which 5 belonged to the Treasury and 10 were swept under the central bank carpet. This deficit was the breeding ground for all our ills, since without deficit, there is no debt, no emission or inflation. Today we find sustained and default-free fiscal surplus for the first time in the last 123 years. This was thanks to the greatest adjustment in the history of mankind. Apply a tourniquet in the monetary broadcast until it takes it to zero. And where is the great architect of that work here? It is my great minister, the best minister of economy in the world, Luis Toto Caputo. Along the same lines, at the beginning of our management, the inflation rate was traveling at a rate of 17,000% annualized in the wholesale index. Today, that same index gave 0.8% for the month of December, which annualized gives 10% and continues to fall. That is, we reduced inflation 1,700 times inflation, and we are every day closer to just a bad memory. In short, we prove that inflation is always, and in every place, a monetary phenomenon. As a direct consequence, we lower the poverty of 54% in the first quarter of 2024 to 38% in the third, and we hope it will continue to fall sustained. In short, we get more than 9 million Argentines out of poverty in less than a year. At the beginning of our management, the exchange gap was 180%. Today, the exchange gap is practically dead, and we work day and night to finish cleaning up the central bank and being able to lift the exchange rate once and forever. During 2024, we saw a strong depreciation of our currency, something unprecedented for our country, which caused the average basic salary to grow from $300 to $1,100. At the beginning of our management, we had a country risk of 1,900 points, which had even been higher. The bonds quoted at $35. Today, the country risk around 600 points and our bonds are around $70, with 2 capital amortizations along the way. Who has followed my advice to bet on Argentina on May 6 will have seen its assets revalued by more than 100%. I know that the famous Stanley Druckenmiller made a commitment to Argentina after that famous Davos speech. I understand that it must have done very well. Lowering country risk to the rhythm we are making allows us to reduce the interest rate of our economy, thus improving the ability of Argentines to access credit, facilitating investment and generating jobs. This is why we reduce our 133% interest rate at the beginning of our 32% management. Today, banks prefer to work as banks in the private sector, instead of placing their weights in the central bank. For this same reason, for 2024 we saw an unprecedented mortgage loan boom in our country. At the beginning of our management, the economy was completely baffled by regulations that hindered everyone's life and scared any type of investment. Today, we already eliminate more than 900 regulations, at the rate of more than 3 per day. Along these lines, we have made available to President Trump and my friend Elon Musk to share what we have learned in the Ministry of Deregulation to help them begin the deregulation process here as well. If we add to this the base law and the DNU as a whole, we have carried out the largest structural reform in Argentina, 8 times larger than that of President Menem in the early 90s. And we still have 3,200 more to do. At the beginning of our management, the street was anyone's land, cut by piqueteros. I do not exaggerate, in 2023 we had about 32 pickets per business day. This even caused the IMF to doubt our ability to carry out the adjustment we made without a social outbreak. However, thanks to the courage and determination of our team, today the piqueteros are afraid to take the street and the citizens of good can circulate calm. As I said before, Argentina went from being used as a global example of everything that should not be done, both doors inside and outside, to be seen with good eyes by investors and citizens around the world. In objective terms, we go from being one of the countries with worse economic results in the last 40 years to be one of the best projected for the next 40. Last May, I invited you to judge us for our intentions. I proposed a country model anchored in 3 untouchable values: the defense of life, the defense of property, and the defense of freedom, that is, the model of liberalism. Today, I invite you to judge us for our first results, which are even superior to any prognosis that would have been done at any time. Even the IMF said that the recession in our country was milder than he had imagined a priori, concluding that speech with the argument that Argentina had all the potential to become the new Rome of the 21st century, a Western Mecca in terms of commercial opportunities and growth for its inhabitants, with freedom as the main engine. Today, that invitation, which might seem abstract, materialized in a process of transformation that already advances at full speed, like a high-speed train in which you can choose to get on and be face-to-face participants of this deed, or choose to be witnesses merely and miss the trip. This growth of which I speak has multiple factors that make it sustainable over time. First, as we can see, the economy has entered into a cyclical recovery that is taking us out of the hell in which they left us. This cyclical recovery is based on two factors. On the one hand, the recovery of real wages and retirement by the collapse of inflation. On the other hand, the recomposition of stock of the companies after the liquidation of the inventories during the first semester of 2024. This will accelerate the revitalization of the economy, and these short-term issues are part of what we are seeing today, which explains the phenomenal growth of the economy in the last quarter of last year. In addition, there is the structural issue. Each of the 15 points of GDP that policy squandered, and we adjust, by definition, a return to the private sector in the form of savings, which will generate an increase in both investment and consumption. On the other hand, the loss of country risk, which helps us reduce the interest rate and lower the intrinsic transactional cost, will also produce a direct increase in investment. In addition, a third factor is added, which is the decline in the tax burden, either due to the elimination of the inflation tax, as I mentioned, or by the reduction of taxes that we have already begun and we will deepen during this 2025. Without going any further, we are working on a structural tax reform that will reduce the amount of national taxes by 90% and return to the provinces the tax autonomy that they should never have lost. Thus, we aim to achieve federalism marked by fiscal competence between the Argentine provinces to see who attracts more investments. The fourth phase on which the growth process that we will see this year has to do with the monetary issue is supported. The convergence of the exchange rate parallel to the official exchange rate, which we are seeing months ago, is a completely unpublished fact in history, because we are used to seeing how the official exchange rate rises to reach the value of the parallel, and does not vice versa. We bring us a centimeter closer to the definitive exit of the exchange rate. An adefesio that should never have existed, and that this year we will end at once and forever. To do this, we are working on different alternatives to give the definitive solution to the stock problems of the central bank, either through a new program with the monetary fund or through agreements with private investors. Above all this, in order to terminate the closing process of the central bank, which we have promised and that will end inflation forever in our country, we are announcing advances towards a scheme of currency skills, so that all Argentines can use the currencies they want in their daily transactions. We already gave the different entities to have this scheme running from March. This means that, from now on, each Argentine can buy, sell an invoice in dollars or in the currency that it considers, except for the payment of taxes, which for now, will continue to be in pesos. This is why I say that this growth process will be sustained in time, that is, we are abandoning this spiral that was our economy, in which one year we advanced and the following year we backed away 2 lockers, and so on, without seeing a real growth of GDP per capita since 2011. This time, growth arrives to stay, accompanied by the fiscal surplus. But to deepen the recovery, a sine qua non condition is also necessary, to free ourselves from the yoke from the chains of foreign trade that today suffocate us, to import and export more goods, services and quality, with better prices. To be able to exploit our comparative advantages, opening us to almost 200 potential new countries that demand all the work that Argentines have to offer, undertaking a process of economic convergence that plays us again along with the world's great powers. Therefore, we are looking to promote, during this year, a free trade agreement with the United States, a treaty that should have happened 2 decades ago. being able to resume the Hayekian discovery process, which was cut with rennet by excess bureaucracy, regulations and taxes, will allow us to generate an exponential growth leap, expanding for all our capacities that are being used today. In physical terms, Argentina today has a large amount of potential energy that we can convert into kinetic energy at all service, catapulting the country to the highest in terms of quality of life. As for potential bioenergy, today we have a mountain range rich in lithium, silver, gold, copper and uranium, minerals that the global economy needs and that, due to neglect, expulsion of investments and lack of long-term investments, we have resisted exploiting. We have a diversity of ecosystems envied by virtually any nation in the world, since we have mountains, forests, glaciers, deserts, jungles, beaches, highlands, lakes, estuaries, steppes and extensive plains. Each of these biomes represents different potential opportunities, from the cultivation of soybeans in the plain and the extraction of oil in the desert, to tourism in the lakes or wine in the mountain. Thanks to the regime of incentives to the great investments that we approve in June, we are beginning to wet the feet in this growth ocean, giving rise to players who never existed in our country, based on giving investments a logical legal framework. More than $200 million already have in requests for investment approval for more than $12,000 million, and there are advertisements for thousands of millions in sectors such as infrastructure, mining, steel, energy, automotive, technology, oil and gas. That is, we already have a preview of how our low tax regime will work. All these large investments will unleash an unheard of unprecedented because, as well as generate new direct jobs, they demand goods and services of companies that already exist in our country, generating thousands of indirect jobs and improving the productivity of all of them. In addition, investments will not only improve the productive matrix of the set, since they work on key and large-scale sectors, but also function as an injection of steroids in our economy, returning to the place that we should never have abandoned. And as if all this were not enough, Argentina also has human capital of the highest level. Wearing almost a century living in a tax hell made us learn to get water to the stones, which led us to have the greatest amount of per capita technological unicorns in the region. In addition, we have hundreds of thousands of Argentines distributed by the planet, working in hierarchical positions of leading companies, either in Europe, Silicon Valley or the Middle East, eager to rebuild the country that saw them born. We are also betting on being pioneers in new industries, such as artificial intelligence, since we have vast extensions of desert land at low temperatures, advantageous conditions to mount large computing and large capacity servers. Not only that, but, as we believe that the current productive capacity of energy is probably not enough, we are anticipating the development of medium modular nuclear reactors, which will allow us to generate efficient, safe and clean energy in a scalable way, allowing us to export this knowledge to everyone with the rise of these technologies. Thus, Argentina will be at the forefront of return to nuclear optimism. Each of these perspectives works as a small blow that feeds a growth flame that began to burn, and will continue to grow with tax decline, such as a multiplier bellows. And if we knew how to achieve all this in a single year, with the entire political apparatus and traditional means against, and despite having only 15% of the deputies and 10% of senators, imagine what we are able to do with wind in favor, once the ideas of freedom begin to have true tangible effects in society. Moreover, imagine what we are able to achieve all if this germ of freedom, in undeniable growth, begins to get infected, with our case study as an example. Agoreros on duty will no longer have arguments to oppose the overwhelming results of reality. That Argentina is doing well is beneficial for all, on the one hand, because the global commercial framework will be even more complex, enhancing all the actors involved in the process. On the other hand, because the nations will begin to lose fear of the cuckoo that imposed us since childhood, that the deregulation only brings barbarism and misery, this being the main reason for the progress with which we have as a species. As I did almost a year ago, I want to invite all of you, fervent defenders of free business capitalism, which if you believe like me that merit, ambition, freedom, innovation and optimism are essential values of the human species that must be awarded, bet on Argentina. They do not even have to do it for Argentina, do it for you and for your own countries. That Argentina serves as an irrefutable example that the only way to eradicate poverty of the pocket and the soul is with more capitalism and less state. And if their compatriots decide to cover the sun with their hand, know that they can always find a home in Argentina for all those who are willing to inhabit our soil and write a new chapter in the history of progress that the West represents. Have all very good morning. May God bless you and that the forces of heaven accompany them. Long live freedom, damn it.